Wherever you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Thank you for joining us on another ride through the mysteries of this wondrous place called planet Earth, speeding through the cosmos tens of thousands of miles per minute. It's one of the things that I love about the topics that we talk about on this show, is that as out there as some of these ideas are, when you think about actual science and you really break down the wondrous aspects of what science has shown us that is real, and or hypothetically possible or theoretically possible, it kind of makes some of these out there theories of ours not seem so out there anymore. And tonight, something a little bit more down to earth, we'll be talking to Dennis Stone, and he is the president of America's Stonehenge in New Hampshire. It's ruins of stones, tunnels, and we don't really know who built it. And there are theories that range from thousands of years ago to near or to colonial settlement times. And that's the big question, is who built this mystery site. We'll get to that in just a moment. As always, the call-in Paranormal Radio App lines will be open in the last 30 minutes. So if you'd like to call and talk to Dennis, ask your questions, offer your theories, perhaps. That would be really interesting to hear from you and what you think this stone ruin is. Call-in number is 85-KGRA-LIVE. That's 1-855-472-5483. Bill Skywatcher, our producer, will have those lines open and ready for you. So wait for your cue to get on the Paranormal Radio App line, and we will bring you on air. As always, follow me on Twitter at paranormal_now for show updates, and of course on Instagram at paranormal now. And next Wednesday, there is the 9-year anniversary for KGRA Radio. So that's going to be a fun live stream. So I hope everybody joins us next Wednesday. And I know I will be tuning in and hanging out all night long. So hopefully I'll see y'all in chat as well throughout the night. And Dennis Stone is the president of America's Stonehenge. He graduated from Daniel Webster College in 1977 with a degree in aviation management and was a full-time commercial pilot for over 35 years before his retirement in 2016. America's Stonehenge was opened to the public in 1958 by Dennis's father, Robert Stone. Dennis has been involved with America's Stonehenge for most of his life and has always had a fascination with archaeology and archaeoastronomy. Since retiring, Dennis has found many serpentine walls and spirit windows through the site, among other new discoveries. He has taken numerous courses and then traveled extensively to ancient sites both in the U.S. and internationally. His family includes his wife Pat, his son Kelsey, and his daughter-in-law Catherine. His hobbies include none other than traveling, boating, and classic cars in the mix. Why not? So there are mystery sites all over the world. And I think this mystery site is often under the radar. And I kind of get the feeling that Dennis Stone's life mission is to change that. Hey, Dennis, welcome to Paranormal Now. How are you?
I'm doing good, Alan. Thank you for having me on this evening.
Thanks. So is that true? Is this your life's mission?
It has been, I think, since I was a baby, about 1 year old. My dad got involved with this, so I've been around it my whole life. And I have my son, Kelsey, as you mentioned, and he has a brand new daughter. So it's like 4 generations. And she's over there all the time now with us, helping to run the place. So it feels like it's a mission, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming back on again. I know you were on once before with Carl, filling in on Paranormal Now here roughly a year ago. And unfortunately, I wasn't around at that time, so I missed out. So, for those who are unfamiliar with America's Stonehenge, where is it? And give us a brief wrap of why you think it's important.
Yeah, it's located in southern New Hampshire in the town of North Salem. We're about 40 miles north of Boston and about 18 miles from the seacoast. And it's about a 110-acre site. It's located on a hill that's called Mystery Hill. And when my dad got involved with it back in 1955, on the topographical maps, it really didn't have a name. So when he opened it in 1958, the name of the business was Mystery Hill Caves. And the name on the topographical maps today is Mystery Hill. So it is kind of a mystery. It's about 110 acres of stone walls, structures, standing stones, astronomical alignments. And you mentioned a couple of things like the serpentine walls and windows and cairns. And there's just so many different features on top of this hill spread out all over it, actually.
Yeah.
And the first real writing was 1907, The History of Salem by Edgar Gilbert, a friend of Robert Frost. They actually worked together in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And when The History of Salem came out in 1907, it talks about this place where it mentions that it's a strange but wonderful place among the soft pines and rough boulders where weird tales may be woven. And it talked about a family that was there about 70 years before that. And so that's one of the first mentions of the site. The first photographs were taken in 1920. We have 4 photographs of different parts of the site. And those are on display in our museum. And then by 1935, newspapers seemed to get interested in the site. And local papers like the Haverhill Gazette actually not only did articles, but they have pictures of the site that, a year before the first research actually began in 1936. And that's when a gentleman from Hartford, Connecticut, Mr. Goodwin, actually purchased the site. He was an antiquarian, an amateur archaeologist. Mm-hmm. And when he first saw the site in 1936, he was just blown away by the whole thing. He was very familiar with mounds out west. In fact, he lived in Ohio for 15 years, about 100 years ago. And he used to go on weekends, map some of the 10,000 ancient mounds out there for the highway department. So he was already kind of tuned into ancient sites. But he lived in Hartford, Connecticut. That's where he was born and grew up. He was the first cousin of J.P. Morgan. And they were involved with insurance. So he lived on the West Coast in Seattle, Washington. He lived in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And eventually he made his way back to Hartford, Connecticut around 1930. And he learned of this site a couple years later. And then he purchased it in 1937 after visiting it. And he thought initially it might be a Viking settlement. But it was so covered with brush and debris, you really couldn't make out all the features. So he hired a crew, and they began cleaning up all the trees, the debris, and excavating some of the soil away from the chambers and doing repairs. And they photographed the entire thing. His right-hand man was a professional photographer. His name was Malcolm Pearson. And he only died 10 years ago at 99 years old, and he was a friend of the family's. But Goodwin changed his tune from Vikings to the Irish Chaldean monks. And when he died in 1950, he still believed that the Irish Chaldean monks were here over 1,000 years ago trying to escape Viking persecution. And this was a monastery. That was his theory.
Was there any
we don't have any real evidence to support that. We think it's a much older site than that. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, when you open, there's a lot of different theories about the site even today, from prehistoric to historic, But we think it's an ancient observatory, a place of celebration, probably not a place of living. It wasn't really a habitat or a domicile site. And the structures you just showed on your screen, some of them are very reminiscent of some of the 50,000 megalithic sites in Western Europe. In fact, that chamber right there is called the south-facing chamber. And it looks similar to some of the fugus found over in Ireland, for instance. I've been to Ireland with my dad. We spent over a week looking at some of the 2,000 megalithic sites there. We saw probably a couple dozen out of the 2,000. And there are chambers that are quite similar to that. They do vary in size and everything, but that chamber is reminiscent of that. And then there's a couple other chambers. There's a V hut. It looks like the letter V is in Victor, and it faces the southwest. And we saw ones like that in Ireland. They call them wedge tombs, and they're always orientated to the southwest. And to the right of that structure, you can see some slabs. And some of the ones over there have the same feature. It's almost like those slabs are used to block up that structure. The ones in Ireland, again, the size, the shape, the orientation is the same, and they were used as tombs, they believe, going back into prehistoric times.
Did you say tubes?
Yes, tombs, burial tombs, Mm-hmm. And we saw several different ones in Ireland, and we saw a couple of them. They look so much like that chamber. And they're in Spain, too. And in Spain, I think they mislabel them as dolmens. Dolmens usually a big rock with legs underneath it, 3 or 4 legs. Mm-hmm. That's actually a structure with 2 walls, kind of shaped like a V. Uh-huh. And the one I saw in Spain, I've been to Spain, but I saw it in photographs. I didn't get to that particular chamber. It not only has a little notch on the top slab, just like ours, like somebody actually made like this little crescent moon shape on the roof slab. You can see a little notch to the right of the roof slab. It doesn't really show up well in the picture, but the ones in Spain has the same notch. And in the front of the chamber, you can see some white paint. It's kind of faded there. There's a basin. And the one in Spain had a basin. This basin's about half as big as ours, but in the same spot. The notch on the slab was in the same spot, but it was about twice as big as our notch. And then it had the stonework to the right, I believe, which may have been blocking stones, perhaps. It was used as a tomb. Somebody got in there and maybe raided the tomb or whatever. But the ones in Ireland, too, looked like they were broken into, you know. So there's a lot of very close similarities. Some people will say it's coincidence, you know, but the size, shape, and then...
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, I mean, if someone just decides to take some stones together, build a structure, you know, it's pretty rudimentary, right? I mean, we're not talking about, you know, fine cut stones everywhere and, you know, cement or anything like that. So if someone just decides, I'm going to get a bunch of stones, build a structure roughly like this, would it just look ancient if one did that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't really tell the age by just looking at it, you know, you know, just when you pile up stones, you have to have other evidence, you know, with the structure to kind of date it. But again, the size of the structure, the shape of the structure, and the orientation out of true north, like southwest, and the ones on the same type of structure, the same shape, it's orientated the same direction on both sides of the ocean. So it's a little bit more, you know, specific, you know. And the chamber that's next to that, just a little bit to the east of that's called the east-west chamber. And the east-west chamber is a pretty cool-looking chamber. We have photographs of it in 1920 with a young man standing there. There it is right there. And the slabs that are vertical are called orthostats. They're actually part of the bedrock at one time, including the roof slab. Those are all part of the bedrock. And the bedrock is granite. It's foliated. It comes up in layers. So somebody was able to work the bedrock and raise the stones off the bedrock and then stand them up. And there's no signs of metal tool marks on these stones, you know, drill marks or anything modern like that. The ones over in Europe, they're in Holland. They call them the Giant's Bed. They're also in Northwest Ireland, and they're in France. I did see some in France when I was in France. I didn't see the ones in Northwest Ireland. And they always run between 20 and 60 feet, and they're always orientated true east and west out of true north. And so same type of structure again, the same orientation, and orthostats, slabs like that. Very, very, very similar to that.
Yeah, when you say oriented true east and north, now, is that contemporary or is that measured to a different distant place in time?
Well, true north is, yeah, the polar axis hasn't really changed. It does precess, and it does the obliquity of the Earth's, you know, axis tilts. It's a 23.5 degree tilt. But the polar axis is still the polar axis, no matter, you know, when you go back in time. So true north today is still true north back then. So you have a structure that runs true north, east, west, or some other kind, you know, other direction.
So
back then,
even if the poles shift a little bit, that true north is always just the physical true north.
The magnetic pole changes constantly, you know, and so we're not talking about magnetic north. It's about 15 degrees west variation, but that changes. I flew. We had to take that, you know, into account when we did all our cross country and all our training and all of that. But true north is what we're talking about. And 4,000 years ago, the pole star was in Polaris. The pole star was Thuban, which is part of the constellation Draco, the dragon or the serpent. And so when the Egyptians set up the Great Pyramid of Cheops roughly 40 years ago, one of the shafts is pointing right at the pole star, which today it will be looking at Polaris. And that's due to the precession, the 25,920-year precession of the Earth's axis. But the Earth is rotating around that axis, and it's still the same axis, you know, that it was thousands or even perhaps millions of years ago. But that axis does move, you know, it points in different directions over that almost 26,000 years. And the 23.5 degree tilt that gives us our seasons, that changes over 41,000 years. It's about 1 minute of change every century. So 40 centuries, 4,000 years, 40 minutes of tilt. The solstices are off a little bit today. The equinox still is the equinox. Where the sun rises to the east, it rose in the same direction, you know, 4,000 years ago or before that. So a lot of people don't understand those cycles of the, you know, what happens with the obliquity cycle and the precession of the equinoxes. A lot of people aren't familiar with that, you know. But that can be used to date the site too, basically.
What can be used to date the site?
The obliquity, the Earth's tilt. So even like 100 years ago, Sir Norman Lockyer in England was looking at some of the megalithic sites, and he noticed like the solstices, and I suppose, I don't know if he looked at the lunar alignments, but anything that's not the equator, even the cross-quarter days, were off a little bit. You know, it's like, there's an error here. They're not quite aligned. When you look at the sun rising over a particular point, it's off a little today. Why is that?
Yeah.
He came up with an idea that the Earth's axis is tilting slowly. And he said, if we could determine when these alignments worked, in the past, we could actually date the site. And that was 100 years ago. And Dr. Alexander Thom from Scotland, he's considered by some the father of archaeoastronomy. He really gets into that starting in the late 30s. We met him in Scotland in 1983. And he worked on some of the 700 stone circles in Scotland, and there's about the same number in Wales and England. And these circles are amazing, but a lot of them are lunar alignments. And they'll be off a little again due to the Earth's tilt. Again, that tilt changes about 1 minute every century. So, 40 centuries, 40 minutes is 2/3 of a degree. The sun's width is about 30 minutes. So you can actually put your thumb and a small finger up, hold it up to an alignment, and that's the era. You can actually visually see the era today, say for a summer solstice or a winter solstice. The lunar alignments, too, they'll be off. The moon goes through an 18-and-a-half-year cycle. In Karnak in France, Stonehenge, and even the Newark, Ohio mounds in Ohio, which are amazing, some of the greatest earthworks in the world built by ancient man, those are aligned with the moon. And I think in 2025 is the next lunar cycle. And it's called the Lunar Major Standstill. And 9 years after that, we'll have the Lunar Minor Standstill. So we'll be watching that at our site. We recently did a forest management program. We've been opening up the alignments since 1967. And we're getting to the point where we opened up the lunar alignments 53 years later. And we had actually a licensed forester we hired in 2018. The project started last year. And it was over 4 months of thinning the forest and opening up all the alignments, including those lunar alignments, which we never opened before. So in 4 years...
When you say open before, what does that mean?
Clearing out several hundred feet of trees.
so that you can see it.
Yeah, the avenues, okay. Yeah. Now, the hilltop 4,000 years ago probably was fairly clear. We have run about 100 shovel test pits since about 1992. And there were some done in the 60s, but this was actually an organized plan by our archaeologist. She was a president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. She started with us in 1989 and worked on the North Stone. The stone is lined with Polaris and 4,000 years ago, Thuban. In 1988, the year before, we noticed the stone was starting to tilt. That's what happens with these stones. They slowly start falling, just like Stonehenge lost some of its stones. That's kind of a monolith right there, and that's actually an equinox sunrise over that particular stone. So in 88, we decided maybe we should excavate around the North Stone, and we brought her in, and she was a president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society. So 89, 90, 91, she worked on that one particular project, 3 years. And then she began what we call a shovel test pit study, STP. And they'll do a 50-centimeter diameter hole, and they go down until they hit a preoccupational level like glacial soil or bedrock, and then they stop. They analyze what they have, look for artifacts. Her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University for 30 years, so she would ask him geological questions. Is this a nature fact, or is this something that geology did, natural forces, or man-made, I should say. So he was a big help in that. So over the next several years, she actually ran these shovel test pits across some of the 110 acres. And what she came up with is that the hilltop probably was about 75% bare bedrock 4,000 years ago and 25% covered with soil, vegetation, and trees. So it's probably more bare. And when you visit with Bill, you'll see outcroppings of bedrock that have never had the soil back on, since the time of the glaciers, probably due to erosion. There's still what we call sheepbacks. And so somebody might say, well, if this site was that old, it should be completely buried with soil. The soil has been accumulating. It's about 125 years for an inch of soil in New England. But at the same time, there's erosion going on, too, on top of the hill. But the hill is a much more open hill. You can see the alignments. You can see all the walls, serpentine walls. And you're looking at the summer solstice sunset right there, looking to the northwest. And that avenue was opened up around 1973 for the first time, since probably ancient times. And on the summer solstice, about a little after around 8:20 at night, 8:24 at night, the sun sets right on the top of that stone there. I don't know if you have a picture of that, but it looks pretty spectacular when it does. That's the winter solstice. It looks like the same stone. It's a different stone. It's in the southwest, and that's a winter solstice sunset picture right there.
How many stones are there?
There's a couple dozen stones. There's 14 avenues. There's actually 16 avenues. There's actually 14 from the astronomical platform, and there's also an east-west equinox just south of that. So that's 16 avenues. There's actually 57 alignments with the sun, the moon, and the stars. There's 24 stellar alignments. We started surveying the site in 1973 after 6 years of clearing trees and working on it ourselves. So we hired a professional survey team. Mm-hmm. We realized we had to have an accurate map to work with. So we hired Beverly Pearson and Associates out of Derry, New Hampshire. I believe Beverly was the president of New England Surveyors Association at the time. We're going back almost 40 years. His son, Charlie, actually did the work up there. And Charlie just retired a few years ago from survey work. Mm-hmm. But he visited us, and he's still in touch with us by email, and he's going to come up and see some of my serpent walls. From 73 to 77, they worked on the survey of what we call Phase A. And there was 15 acres where the astronomical alignment stones are. And they went out and surveyed the walls and the monoliths, and they actually put little brass pins in the stones, marking them permanently. All this data was collected, and in 1977, we sent it to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. During that winter of 77, 78, they analyzed the data, and in 78, we get the results back in the name of the person that did I still have all that collected in my files, in the big files. And they said if these were used for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus a couple hundred years. And again, that's due to the Earth's tilt change, the obliquity. And that agreed with our carbon dating from 1971. We have taken 12 carbon dating starting in 1967 all the way up to the 1995. The 1971, the oldest one, and what we call the main site. The main site is where most of the structures are. You just showed some pictures of the chambers, like the east-west chamber, the V-hut, and the south-facing chamber. That's about a 1-acre area. It's kind of a high density of structures, but there are structures outside of that too. And that's actually a picture of the sacrificial table with a large monolith standing right in the foreground. You can see, and it has a little notch on the left side of that big standing stone. The table there is about 9,000 pounds. It's about 9 feet by 6 feet on 4 legs. So we surveyed all that data, and they took their 5 years doing it because we had to pay for it. So we had to raise funds to actually pay for the survey work. So 1971, we got a date on the main site of 4,000 years old, plus or minus about 250 years. So here we are 7 years later with the astronomical information, and they both agreed that the site was probably constructed around 4,000 years ago. So we used both astronomical data and carbon-14 to date it, basically.
So Dennis, the 1,800 years ago versus 4,000 years ago, how does that work?
1800 BC. 1800 BC.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, if I slipped, I do apologize. I don't mean to confuse anybody. 1800 BC. Yeah.
That might have been me. So can you, in your words, describe to listeners, what the layout of this looks like? So there's the central structure, and then you have these stone, monuments that surround it. Is that how this works?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, these astronomical marker stones are not quite in a perfect circle, but they are around the main site, and their distance is roughly 500 to 700 feet to the furthest stone out there. Okay. And these are the monoliths. You just showed 2 of them, winter solstice and the summer solstice sunset stones. They look like big arrowheads, basically.
Is it roughly?
And so you have the central
1,000 feet. Is it roughly 1,000 feet diameter then?
About that, yeah. I would say that's the 15 acres, and we have almost 110 acres. When you're looking at an astronomical alignment, you have to have 2 points, a foresight and a backsite. So the backsite, the foresight's the one you're looking at in the distance. The backsite is the one closest to you, and that's what we have. You have to have like a gun sight to look at. You can't just have the object you're looking at, because you can make any day of the year. It would be meaningless, So you have to have 2 points, and then you have the object, the sun, the moon, or a star, rising or setting over that particular point. And so the stones I'm talking about are out there about 500 feet or a little bit more than that, and those are the foresights we're looking at. And what we found out too is some of them are shaped like arrowheads, and the summer solstice sunrise stone is asymmetrically shaped. It has a point on the left and it slopes down to the right. And when we opened that avenue up around 1973, so you could see the horizon, kind of to our, there it is right there. You can't see the horizon there, but you can see the shape of the stone. If about 5 miles distance approximately, there are 2 hills that come together, and they're actually shaped like that slope. So when you stood back from the stone, there's actually a stone circle where you can it's elliptical shape. And by standing there, you're at the right elevation. You look at that foresight, and then you look at the far distant horizon. You can see them both. You can make them line up. And then you wait. And in the morning of summer solstice, the sun will rise. And today it will be on the bottom of the stone to the right. And 4,000 years ago, the sun was a little bit more than its width up to the left. And it was near the top, near that little point there. Yeah, near that. Just slightly, there's like a little notch before the point. And we estimate that's where the sun would have been 4,000 years ago. And today it's towards the bottom right of the stone. And that's, again, due to the Earth's tilt. And it's the same on the horizon. In Europe, they call them horizon features. They took little notches that were natural or little peaks, and they used those as part of the alignment. It's kind of cool.
All right. There's so much more to cover. So when we get back from the other side of this break, we have questions from chat, questions from myself, questions from Bill Skywatcher. There's a lot of interest in this topic. And, there's so many more mysterious features that we haven't discussed. And I'd also like to get into how people are embracing this culturally. I know there are events and things that take place there as well. So we'll cover this and just so much more. We're just getting warmed up. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio, the best in alternative talk radio. We will see you on the flip side.
Tell me why, with 12 sides, the odds are that we die, roll the dice, as too high, I can't find you on the other side of the line.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
On and again, the signs keep on coming, they point to the end, but I hold on so tight.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Taking us out of the break was music by Septembrio. If you want to find out more about Septembrio, go to Septembrio, www.septembrio.com. And as always, in the last 30 minutes of this show, we're going to open up the Paranormal Radio App lines. And that number is 1-855-472-5483 or 85-KGRA Live. All right, let's keep flying tonight with Dennis Stone. Dennis, so I understand the astronomical significance here. But is that enough to convince an archaeologist that this is not some colonial settlement?
Right, yeah. There's still a lot of controversy about this site as to its age, who built it, what it was used for. Generally, when we hear that, from some of the mainstream archaeologists, they really don't get into the astronomy. They kind of ignore it. Because when you have 57 different alignments up there, the only thing I've heard before is it's a coincidence. So I think that might be stretching the word coincidence a little bit when you have these alignments. These stones are stood up. You can see they're shaped like arrowheads, or the one in the summer solstice actually asymmetrically shaped. And some of these are up to 10 feet tall. And, the line, with the sun, the moon, and stars. So if somebody wants to believe coincidence, I took probability and statistics in college, and I think it's beyond that, a coincidence. The same would be true of the other sites in Europe. If, like Stonehenge, then you'd probably use the same argument that it's just a coincidence. But I think we have more alignments than Stonehenge has, actually, because the Harvard report in 78 said you have 24 star alignments. We knew we had the one with Polaris or Thuban 4,000 years ago. We did not know at that time that we had 23 other star alignments. And about 1997, a doctor of astronomy from Penn State came up and he introduced himself. And he began working on the stellar alignments for us, because we hadn't really got into that. And he actually drew up maps and diagrams and found these different stars, and he published some of this stuff. So we have a pretty good idea of what star alignments we have too. That's the visitor center right there. And that part of the building actually was redone in 1994, but originally it was put up in 1957, and we opened up right around the summer solstice of 1958. So we've been going for about 63 years now.
And your family named it the America's Stonehenge, right?
Well, originally it was Mystery Hill Caves, and that confused people. They thought they were like natural caverns or caves, or, the two different things, caverns and caves, but
Sure.
They thought they were this kind of like caves, And so we dropped the name Caves in 1963. It became just Mystery Hill. And the work on the astronomical alignments actually began in 1965. It was because of a book by Gerald Hopkins. He was at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He was from England originally, and he wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded, which became a bestseller. And that and the CBS special in 1965, I believe it was The Mysteries of Stonehenge. I've seen the show twice, but it's been over 40 years since I saw it last time. I was at a library. But when it aired in 1965 on CBS, we saw it too. And that really triggered a lot of interest in these stones that are out in the middle of the woods at our place. We knew they were there. We didn't know what their function was. So that got the interest in, hey, do we have something that could align with the sun or moon or something like that?
Yeah.
And by 1967, we started clearing out the avenues. And just recently with the Forest Project, as I mentioned, we just finally got to some of the star alignments 53 years later, almost 54 years later. So the name was changed in 1982 to America's Stonehenge to better, explain what the function of the site is astronomically. The form is not like Stonehenge. Stonehenge is very unique. But the form is more like some of the other megalithic sites, some of the other 50,000 megalithic sites scattered throughout Western Europe. Mm-hmm. But people don't know that these sites go right through Russia. The Ural Mountains have over 3,500 of these megalithic sites, and they have their own website. They're in China, India. South Korea had something like 80,000 megalithic sites. These are going from the New Stone Age, Neolithic, into the Bronze Age. Recently, we found out, actually 10 years ago, I found out that they're in Australia. They have the Aussie Stonehenge, and there's other structures. And recently, New Zealand, I did a radio show with a host out of New Zealand about 5 years ago, and we were talking all about these megalithic sites around the world. They're in Africa, on every continent, including South America. So 6 continents out of 7 have megalithic sites.
Are there similarities between those sites?
And you look at them, there's a lot of similarities. Like you say, when you build out a stone, there may be only so many shapes, but there are different shapes, of course, Mm-hmm. But these are megalithic. Megalithic means big stone, just make 2 Greek words, mega and lithos, big stones. And we just found out, I think about a year ago, that there are megalithic structures in New Zealand. I haven't seen the photographs, but the host that I was with 5 years ago never brought it up. So maybe it's something relatively new they've discovered there.
Discovery. Yeah. So do you ever have issues with local archaeologists or the government even? Because if this is recognized as historically significant, I imagine being a private landowner, there could be some issues there with how you treat the site, how you manage and potentially dig.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are about 800 different sites from Quebec all the way down to Pennsylvania. Now, a site could be like ours of, say, 110 acres with, literally dozens and dozens of different stone features on our site. Mm-hmm. A site could be one chamber in a town. Next to us is the town of Windham, New Hampshire, and it has a chamber. And that chamber, by the way, looks like if you pull up the Ural Mountain megalithic website, one of the chambers comes up and it looks just like the one in Windham, New Hampshire. It has a roof, it has a space, it has a lintel, and has cobbles in between the spaces. The stonework looks like it's a twin, including a big stone block by the entranceway that's just laying down on both structures. Mm-hmm. And I showed the picture to everybody, and they say, well, it's the same structure. So, well, that one's 7 miles, and the other one's about 7,000 miles away in the Ural Mountains. Yeah. So these other sites are on private land. They're on public land, federal, sometimes they're on federal government land. Mm-hmm. But the state, our state of New Hampshire is really, the only thing they did in 1970 is designate us as a state of New Hampshire historic site. We have a marker on Route 28 about 4 miles from us. Yeah. And that's about the only thing you ever showed of interest with our site. So if it was up to the state, the site probably would be house lots today. The town of Salem has been pretty nice to us. I think they realized, the site may be an ancient site. And so, I think they consider it something, something important. It does bring a lot of people into the area to hotels, buy gas. but also interest, and it's kind of cultural. We think it's a cultural site.
Yeah.
The oldest carbon dating we have was done by, I believe, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute back around 1995, and it was calibrated. The results was calibrated by the University of Washington out in Seattle, and it was about 7,400 years old. And what it looks like is somebody built a campfire on top of the hill that early in time. It doesn't say they were building the walls or the chambers or structures, but it shows human activity on top of the hill going back to what we call the Middle Archaic time period. But mainstream archaeologists, basically all the decades that I've been involved, have basically said there aren't any ancient stone ruins, structures, standing stones, walls in the Northeast. If they're there, they have to be colonial, post-colonial, basically the works of farmers and early settlers.
Well,
there should be no ancient cultures building these things, basically.
Well, we know Vikings came over. So why do they dismiss the possibility that could have been Vikings?
Right. They don't have any Viking site in the United States yet that they've recognized. There are different inscriptions that have been found, like the Narragansett stone, the Spirit Pond moonstones, which my dad worked on back in 1972, and other stones going as far west as Minnesota. They do recognize Lonzo Meadow in Canada as being about 1,000 years old. And when I grew up, what we were taught is the Vikings were there for probably a season in Newfoundland, and then they left. Later in time, more recently, I heard that they were there, and I've read in TV shows and reading that they might have been there for about 25 years. PBS did a show about 3 years ago about a second Viking settlement in the southwest part of Newfoundland, Point Rosie, and it was found by the Worldview 3 satellite. And Sarah Packard out of I think she's out of Birmingham, Alabama. She's a space archaeologist, is what they call her. She uses satellites to locate things. And she found that site there about 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And it's the second Viking settlement found since 1960 when they found Lonzo Meadow, and they recognized it as such. So that might be the second Viking settlement. But at the end of that PBS special, they think the Vikings may have been coming in for 400 years. The Viking era actually ends around 1050 AD, but it would have been the post-Vikings coming in until almost the time that Columbus finally came over. So they may have not just gone to Newfoundland. You have 400 years. I think you do a bit of exploring. The St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes, possibly. That hasn't been proven yet. And maybe down the eastern seaboard, too. You just have to find the evidence to prove it, though, just like they did in 1960,
Sure, yeah. But, it sounds like people are thinking in terms of, modern borders. But, back then it was just North America.
Yeah,
Greenland,
exactly.
North America. It was just landmass. So
exactly.
Just because they were found to have a settlement in Greenland or Finland, Newfoundland, doesn't mean they didn't make it down to America at some point.
That's the way I feel.
Yeah. So,
but there were different Native American tribes that would have been, Native Americans would have been friendly in some cases. There were like 500 tribes, so they may have encountered Native Americans that were friendly and others that may have not been as friendly, exchanging goods and stuff like that. There's a cat, the Maine coon cat is a state cat of Maine, and they did some DNA testing, and they found that half of the cat is an extinct feral cat that's no longer in Maine. The other is a Norwegian forest cat. A Norwegian forest cat is a cat that Vikings may have had on their ships to keep away the rats. So it's a theory. I don't know how accepted it is, but the Maine coon cat, if you Google it, looks like a half a Viking cat, basically. So the Vikings, now either the cat made it down from Newfoundland or maybe the Vikings stopped along the way and some of these cats. It's an interesting theory, nevertheless. It might be a piece of supporting evidence, maybe not.
Wait, so did these cats, could they not have been brought down later, years later? Not
when the first Europeans came in, the cat was there, I guess.
I see.
But it could have been, it could have been brought in 1,000 years ago to Newfoundland, and maybe over, some time it actually did its own migration down, like maybe that's what you're thinking. Possibly, yeah, or it was brought there.
And so what evidence is there that it could have been Vikings specifically? Or do we...
As far as the cat?
No, as far as the site, Stonehenge.
Yeah, we don't have any evidence of it being Viking. Not that they didn't come and see the site, but you had to have something tangible to hold in your hand and say, this is Viking. The site, actually, a group formed in 1954 called the Early Sites Foundation. They lasted until 1964. When some of the members died, there were members from Dartmouth College. There was president of the Connecticut Archaeological Society and various other people that came together because of our site. And they looked at about 15 other sites in the Northeast that they knew of at the time. One of the gentlemen and his son actually went to Newfoundland to work on that site in 1960, Lonzo Meadow. And it was his son, I believe, that found the little stone whorl. And that was the actual first piece of hot evidence that I've read, hope I'm not mistaken. And the credit really should go to the young man that was part of the Early Sites Foundation. The National Geographic, of course, was there. And they seem to get a lot of credit for the discovery of Lonzo Meadow, along with Helger and Inna Instad and Helger. There was a husband and wife team, anyway, that worked on it. Helger and Anna Instad, I think their name was. And Brigida Wallace is the one that's part of Canadian Parks National, I guess it's called, that is in charge of that site today. And they actually created a recreation of Lonzo Meadow. But it was the Early Sites Foundation. And actually, Malcolm Pearson, the gentleman that just died, he was given the site in 1950 when Goodwin died. He actually, for all his hard work, Goodwin gave it to him in his will. Goodwin was a millionaire, Malcolm. And anyway, he was very nice to Malcolm, gave him the site. And that's the gentleman that my dad eventually bought the site from. Mm-hmm. And Malcolm was one of the founding members of the Early Sites Foundation, too. In 1964, because that group kind of dissolved, my dad started a group called New England Antiquities Research Association, and the acronym is NERA. And they're still going strong today. A couple of their members have had their own shows on History Channel, for instance, So the group is very active. And in September 11th last year, we had new dating techniques never used at our site before. It's called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. Mm-hmm. It's been around for probably well over a decade, I guess, but it's fairly new, in archaeology. And they actually can date dirt. They can actually date stone. It has to have either feldspar or quartz in it. And our stone has a lot of that, and our dirt does too. So on September 11th, 25 people came together at our site and spent the entire day there. We had Dr. Feathers from the University of Washington. I mentioned that university before. We had 2 people from Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island come up, and they assisted Dr. Feathers. And then we had our 2 state archaeologists. You had mentioned the archaeologists before, locals. And these gentlemen work for the state of New Hampshire. I had never met them before. Our archaeologist, though, the lady I mentioned, she knows everybody, right? Because she's been in it since the 1970s. And she's friendly with everybody. She tries to bend their ear, look outside the box, look at the site. Don't think of it as just a colonial or post-colonial construction. And she's done that with some of the people she knows across New England. So we had these 2 state archaeologists there for the first time ever. They observed everything. Mm-hmm. Our archaeologist, the lady I mentioned, Pat Hume, she was there with her assistant. And we had ground penetration radar people there. We also had LIDAR people there mapping it. So when they took the course, the LIDAR had already been done in the spring. We had mapped 15 acres. That's for the astronomical. And the gentleman had handheld LIDAR. It's $50,000 unit. It can measure down to 1 centimeter. It puts out something like 300,000 points per second, or in a square meter, 150,000 points. To put that in perspective, drone LIDAR last year only put out 400 to 800 points, and airborne 4 to 8 points. So we got LIDAR of our hill back in about 10 years ago. And when you look at the walls, and you can see the walls on the LIDAR, they're all blurry. But the handheld LIDAR, you can see down to 1 centimeter. So high resolution. It has 16 lasers. It has 1 high-definition camera. And so he spent 600 hours actually processing that data from the 15 acres. We have not done the other 90 acres just because of time and the amount of, you have to put into it. It's all 3D. It's in color. And he can strip away all the trees and vegetation. At the same time, his friend from Waltham, Massachusetts, with LIDAR Solutions International, brought her ground penetration radar up, and she mapped a few thousand square feet, including the area where some of the OSL cores were taken. And this radar can see ideally down to 100 feet below the surface. But she mentioned, like, if you were out on a road and it had salt on it in winter, you might see 2.5 feet down. So it varies, So what they're doing is they're taking her imagery, and they have some new software. They're going to take his imagery, and they're going to blend it together for above and below the surface 3D imaging. And they're working on that right now. And it will show where the cores were taken in the oracle chamber. We had 3 cores.
Okay.
It used to take 5 years to get the results back for OSL. In 2018, they did a structure, one of these strange structures we've been talking about in Pennsylvania, the Owsley Hill structure. And I don't know what the name of the town is. I forget at the moment. And it's one of these things that probably should have been built in colonial or post-colonial times. It really shouldn't be there in ancient times, according to mainstream archaeologists and scholars, historians, and debunkers and stuff. So in 2018, they took the cores, and 2 years later, last year, they got the results. And the results ranged, they took several cores, so they got different results. And the results went from 3,000 something BC, so over 5,000 years ago, up to about 500 AD. And they said the weighted average, the central, they call it central point or whatever, some terminology used, they say the average was about 570 BC. So this structure wasn't built, 300 years ago.
So can that be presented as incontrovertible evidence that this is not?
That's my question too. I think, when you have skeptics and debunkers, they don't care about the facts, the data, the evidence. They have their own agenda. So no matter what you submit in front of them, nothing pleases them. I think it is. I mean, maybe they'll agree with that too. You'll have to talk to them. To me, that seems like this is hard science. This isn't somebody's opinion. I think it's this old. I think it's this old. This is real science, Well, and that's what we did on our site too.
Science testing, requires repeatable, right? Test results. So is that what they're saying now, or do you have plans to bring in another team or do the same test, with the core samples in a adjacent area?
Well, they did 7 places. That place in Pennsylvania was a separate project. It's over $1,000 per core, and I think they took a couple, several different cores down there. Mm-hmm. Our site, they took 4 cores, and they did one site. So that during that, I think it was about a 9-day period. We were on September 11th, and before and after that, Dr. Feathers and his crew was out for several days, and they were in Rhode Island for 1 test, 1 in New York, 2 in Connecticut, and then they did 3 in New Hampshire, our site, and then there were 2 north of us, 2 different towns north of us. And the results should be done within a year. So we got our first results back. It was uncalibrated, and it was basically it wasn't clarified. But the time period of this wall, it's in front of what we call the watch house. We believe it's the end of a 2,550-foot serpentine. They chose that particular wall because it looked like it was, untouched, the soil and everything. They had to look at it, examine it, and say, yeah, it looks like it's not been messed around with. This soil cannot be exposed to sunlight. So if a chipmunk had dug a hole and the sun rays penetrated and then it filled back in, if you took a core there, later, you'd have a contaminated core. It would tell you when the chipmunk was in a hole. Mm-hmm. And what it is you build a wall, and then very slowly over time, windblown particles and vegetation decay build up soil, about, like I mentioned, 125 years, 100 years for an inch of soil. So they took a core kind of close to the top surface. They probably should have gone down to the bottom near the bedrock. But they did aim it down a little ways. And the results came out between 1600 and 1400 AD. Now, this precedes the Patty period, the Patty family that was there, and Jonathan Patty by a couple hundred years. So sometimes you'll Google us and you'll see somebody putting comments about, the Patties built it. Jonathan Patty got the land in 1801 from his mother in a quitclaim, and he had his family there in 1802. So Jonathan built everything. Well, this puts it back more than 200 years before, he even got the land, So this is pre-colonial New Hampshire, which is 1623. And it could go back to 1400, but that's near the surface. There's probably several inches of soil there. So it might have taken, a number of centuries for that soil to build up to that level, and then that's the core that they took. So they're actually dating the soil. When did it see the last time it saw the light of day, basically, is what they're doing. And they can do that on rock surface too.
I was just doing.
But the other 3 samples were taken in the oracle chamber on the main site, 1 in the roof and 2 in the walls. And we haven't got those results back yet. So we're anxiously waiting to see what that comes up with, and the other 6 sites in the Northeast. Those will be really interesting to see. I'm excited about those too.
Well, because that if any of those are proven to be ancient as well, it supports your hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah,
I think it does. Like years ago, we heard, well, if your site is an ancient culture of stone builders, how come there's no other sites? They're actually, like I mentioned, 800. It could be one chamber in a town, or it could be a town of North Stonington, Connecticut. In 2016, I went to a meeting in Groton, Connecticut, and a PowerPoint presentation was about North Stonington. We've been around this for decades. I didn't know there was chambers in North Stonington. I mean, they're all over the landscape. I didn't really pay attention to North Stonington. It's really close to Groton, just to the east of it. And this book was written by a gentleman named Markham Starr. He writes for Yankee Magazine. He's a book writer of New England fishing villages. He's a photographer. He was there for 30 years living next to some of these stone ruins, and he was told they're all built by farmers. And landscape of North Stonington is hilly, rocky. The soil's not very arable for growing crops. It's treacherous, and it has a lot of swampland. There's something like 8,000 features in that one town that are similar to what we have. Chambers, standing stone cairns, serpentine walls. They count something like 400 of them, from 100 feet up to 300 feet in length. The average is about 100 feet. There's stone windows, and there's even D-shape, like in the letter delta. We have one of our walls. I noticed it when I built a diorama in 1977, and it's in our visitor center when you enter it. It covers about 30 acres of the site, not the entire hill. But I built it in college, and I said, gee, this wall looks like the letter D. Well, they have those D-shaped walls there, whether it's coincident or not, but they have the same repeating pattern there. So he wrote the book, and he did the PowerPoint presentation, and I was just blown away by particularly the serpentine walls, because I had found 3 of them by that time in the fall of 2016. And I didn't know any other place had them. I didn't know if they were really serpentine walls. I didn't know if they'd be something that would be repeating, out there. Mm-hmm. Since that time, we find they're in the Berkshires, they're in Rhode Island, they're in Pennsylvania. Nearer's Journal last year had a picture from 1997 of one of these walls with a great big serpent head and the body twisting behind it. In a time in 1997, they just called it an unusual wall. But it looks like a serpent. It looks like does look like a head, body, and a tail.
Let's hold it there, Dennis, because we have our second and last break coming up just now. But I want to ask you a question about serpentine formations, and I was doing a little reading up on the Jersey Devil, and so I have some questions for you when we get back from the other side of this break. I'm wondering if there is actually a connection between these two things. And to everybody else out there, thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be back on the other side of this break with Dennis Stones. I know you have so many questions, and I promise you we're going to get to them on the second hour of Paranormal Now on KGRADB.com. I will see you all on the inverted flip side.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRARadio.com.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Yes, this is the last hour. We're going to cruise through the night with our many questions of curiosities of this ancient site called America's Stonehenge. If you want to find out more about America's Stonehenge, go to www.stonehengeusa.com. Will this Stonehenge be the pride of America in years to come? Dennis Stone probably thinks so. So Dennis, I mean, you've put your life into this, right? And what did your family, your parents, think about this? I mean, do you have any differing opinions about the site than what they had?
I think we've discovered a few things. Since my dad passed away, he passed away about the end of 2009, and the serpentine walls, we didn't know anything about them until 2016. We have these windows we found, 14 windows. These are beautiful linteled windows found in the stone walls too. And those started we started finding those in 2016 also. And I just retired from the airlines, and I was worried about getting bored, because we've been around the place forever. Not that the place is boring, but, being there 7 days a week and everything, and we finding different features up there that really was exciting, and it made the days pass very quickly. My mom passed away a year and a half ago. She was 16 days short of her 100th birthday, so she was around it for a long, long time too, But and I told her about some of the new finds and everything. So basically, we still think it's an ancient site. I think my dad would be surprised, though, that these sites seem to be on 6 continents. We knew about Western Europe. We knew there are others in the Northeast, but going into Russia and all those other places we mentioned, I think because of, Google, you can Google these things too and find them very easily today. But I think you'd be surprised that that they're spread out all over the world, And we're also finding things at our site like a standard unit of measure. When you build something, you use a yardstick or a ruler or something like that to build, and the Egyptians had the cubic. In Western Europe, there was a Dr. Alexander Thom, I mentioned him earlier. He actually discovered the megalithic yard. And it was controversial at first that these ancient primitive people could actually use a measuring stick, to build these structures. I don't know why, but that's, prejudice, I guess. But anyway, it's about 32.64 inches is a megalithic yard. And then it breaks down to like a half a megalithic yard and a fathom, which is 2.5 megalithic yards, and even a megalithic inch. And this pattern repeats itself throughout some of the 50,000 megalithic sites. However, in Spain, where some of the most magnificent, in Portugal too, magnificent megalithic sites are, they had a thing called the Spanish Vera. And it wasn't 3264, it was about 3268. So it's very, very close to a megalithic yard.
Yeah.
And there may be a relationship between the two of them.
Well, I was going to ask you, between all of these, doesn't that seem kind of uncanny that there would be such a similar? And how do you prove that there's a system of measurement there?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Thom went out. He was a doctor of engineering. He began looking at the megalithic sites in the late 1930s. He lived up in Dunlop, Scotland. Mm-hmm. And he actually worked for a couple of aircraft companies during World War I, and then between wars and going into World War II. And he actually taught at Oxford University. So he had a degree at Glasgow, University of Glasgow, and he worked there. And he was involved with Oxford University as an engineer, a doctor of engineering. And I believe when he left there in the 1960s, when he retired, they named the building after him. His name was THOM, Dr. Alexander Thom. And he's considered by many the father of archaeoastronomy, how ancients align the sites with the heavens. He really got into that in the late 30s. And by 1967, he published a book about, or he put out a booklet, I guess it was, all about the megalithic yard. And again, that raised a lot of ruckus in archaeologists, because they have a certain view of things. And if you step in on their territory and you're an engineer, you're an outsider, an astronomer, maybe an epigrapher studying languages, they don't particularly like that. They should all work together, really.
Well, you would think, and you would think that archaeologists would want to make
territorial.
You think they want to make that next big discovery, right? Wouldn't you be at least interested in the possibility before, taking the easy way and just saying, oh, it's probably, this, without really, it reminds me very much of ufology. And a lot of people who are skeptics or debunkers, they don't go on site. They don't talk to the witnesses. They don't measure. They don't take samples. They just read what they read online, and then they come up with a conclusion. And it's usually something that is an easy explanation, but it's wanting in the fact that it's leaving out evidence. And that sounds like what these archaeologists are kind of doing. I understand they have reputations to protect. I totally understand that. But it seems like, how hard would it be just to take the time and communicate with someone like you? And they don't have to come to a conclusion, right? They could at least just take their time, do the work, look at the evidence. Exactly.
It sounds like the same thing. And what you said is exactly the same thing in the field of archaeology too. Mm-hmm. And I guess, there are Paul classes, we have our archaeology version of those too,
Well, I was mentioning before we, left for the break that I was reading up on the Jersey Devil, and you were mentioning these serpentine features that you're now, I guess, investigating more. And throughout America, there are serpent mounds. We're aware of this. And in New Jersey, some of the ideas behind the Jersey Devil was that, there was actually lore or mythology that existed before the Leeds family, which is the apparent origin story of the Jersey Devil. And that Native American mythology was based around like a dragon type or a serpent type of a creature. And because we have rivers and streams that are or once were called Drake and Kill, which is Dragon River, or there are French variations on that. And I wonder, is there something to that? It's on this East Coast here, where the serpent shape or serpent figure, whether it's a mythological being or not, or otherwise, maybe there's a connection there. Have you found any connection in your research to this serpentine kind of motif?
Yeah, definitely this. Well, I found my first one in 2016 in the spring, and I saw this wall. It was on the ridge of bedrock. It seemed to have a head, a big block of stone. It looked like a head. It actually had fallen forward. And behind it, the wall tapered down to a flat stone. Almost looked like, to me, like a rattlesnake. It was on the ridge of bedrock. And then I found two more during the course of 2016. And then when I went to the meeting in the fall and saw some of the ones in the book, and on the PowerPoint presentation, I said, that's exactly what we have at our site. There's a lot of mythology. I mean, it goes even in the Bible, Adam and Eve with the serpent. The Egyptians had the cobra, and because in Mexico, there was Quetzalcoatl, and so it seems to be a worldwide thing. Even St. Patty drove out the serpent worship out of Ireland, And you mentioned Serpent Mound. It's a great serpent mound in Peebles, Ohio. It's about 1,350 feet long. It is astronomically aligned with the solstices and equinoxes, and it was built on the ridge of a meteorite crater, and they didn't know that until recently. That was actually a meteorite crater. I guess that's been established in the last 10 years or so. That there's 94 others like that going all the way out to Idaho. Same, and some are bigger. I mean, not bigger, but some are smaller, some are linear, some are in the same kind of shape. That one seems to be eating an egg, although I know there's some restoration work done to the head of that serpent. But if anybody has a chance to go out to Ohio, that's one of the 10,000 mounds there, and it's an effigy mound, and it is shaped like a serpent. But these stone walls that we have at our place, and we believe we have 14 now, and there's hundreds in Connecticut, and I mentioned some of the other states, but we found out there's one in the White River in Mound State Park, Indiana, and it looks like one of our S-shaped. We have some that are linear, they're kind of straight serpents. Some are rectilinear with a head 90 degrees or tail, and some are kind of curved linear, if you want, kind of like an S-shape. And then we have a couple that actually loop around, and the tail goes right by the head. And if anybody knows about us, Ouroboros, and that's where a serpent's biting its tail, and it's a symbol of eternity, symbol of like the circle of life. And Egyptian artwork, jewelry, I've seen photographs of it in the Ouroboros in their artwork. The Greeks and even Native Americans, I think, the Ouroboros, and we think 3 Ouroboroses at our site. After that gentleman spoke with his PowerPoint at that meeting, there's a lady from Colorado on the eastern side of Denver. She mentions kind of the county area where it was. We were in Denver just around that time, and it's just Colorado's so huge, but it's in the flat part of Colorado, east of Denver, and it's as flat as a pancake almost. Yeah. And that's where she found standing stones, cairns, and she found some of the walls shaped like the letter D, as I mentioned, the delta-shaped walls. And then she shows some of her serpent walls. And one of the linear serpent walls had a kind of a big triangular stone head with a body going straight behind it. And my wife and I both sat up in a seat and said, that's almost an identical twin to one of our 14 out 2,000 miles away. And they have other serpent walls here too.
Well, Alabama. It seems to me that settlers wouldn't need or would not be building serpentine walls. I mean, they have other concerns, more practical concerns, right? And
I think out there might be more understanding that these could be ancient, because it wouldn't be practical for a settler, farmer, rancher, or homesteader. What would you build that for? You're trying to make a living. In New England, we have about 240,000 miles of farmers' walls or agricultural walls, and they're usually fairly straight walls with some exceptions. They're pretty linear, and they're made out of a lot of round stonework, which are called field stones left by the glaciers, kind of rounded type rock, generally speaking, And there can be some good sized stones in these walls. The walls at our site and some of the other New England sites have huge flat stones, kind of like you saw in the East-West Triangle. Big flat stones stood on the end called the northostat. They're right in the stone walls. Sometimes they're stood up, and we call them monoliths, and they might be aligned with sun, moon, or stars. And then there's these little structures built into the walls. And then the other thing we have is windows. That's called the watch house. That's one of the satellite chambers. And we believe, you can't quite see it, but the boulder to the right is a glacial boulder. But when you step back and look at it, it looks like the head of a serpent. And it goes behind, and it undulates 3 times. The head is actually a lunar minor standstill moonrise, which will be coming up around 2034. It's also a cross-quarter day, and the cross-quarter day is February 1st. In Europe, they name these with Celtic names, but if you go to one of the biggest mountain complexes just east of St. Louis in Illinois called Cahokia Mountain State Park, it had 120 pyramids at one time, and its nickname is America's Woodhenge. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I've been there. And so it's the same kind of, they have those alignments there too. They have the quarter days, summer, winter, spring, and fall, and then the cross-quarter or mid-season day. There's a picture of Stonehenge being restored. Same thing happened with our site too, and people often say, well, your site had restoration done by Mr. Goodwin, so, he ruined it. Well, that's not true. We know what it looked like before Goodwin and during the restoration. But all ancient sites of the world, unless they've just been recently found, like Göbekli Tepe, and that's being restored too, have had work done to repair them, And that's a classic picture of Stonehenge having one of the lintel stones put back on top of the two uprights.
Yes, and I also appreciate the text that accompanies it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Remember to set your rocks back.
Somebody sent me one of those, and said, have you done your site yet? And I said, no, I haven't. I've been too busy. Got to get the crane out, But the serpents we're finding them in Alabama. They call them rattlesnake walls. And there's a Dr. Holstein, and he's from Jacksonville State University. And I got in contact with him last year, and we were supposed to meet him down there, but we got stopped because of C-19 two trips. We were going to do a southern from South Carolina and see some of the mountains, like the Etowah Mounds in Georgia, go right across to Louisiana, see Poverty Point, Watson Break, all these amazing ancient mounds, and see him at the university. He was going to take me out and show some of his serpent walls. Wow, and he's known about some of these since the 1970s, and we just got together, and now he knows about the Northeast, and we found out about his. I got 110 pictures on the computer at our museum of a place called Weed, California. It's right next to Mount Shasta. And they're the same kind of walls that we have here in New England. And they have the serpent walls.
Well, it seems to me like there's a great collaborative effort going on now with you and other site owners. And I think that's great. That's probably something that was more tedious or less common, 10, 20 plus years ago. And now you can so easily share information with each other. And I think that's fantastic because maybe it's going to take that collective, if I may, amateur archaeologists or enthusiasts to move this into the realm of academia so that they can finally pay attention with undeniable, evidence. But I want to get to the stone slab here. So in this image, we've heard different theories, right? That this could be a sacrificial table for animal sacrifice, human sacrifice. What do you think it's for?
We don't, I wouldn't want to put forth what it actually was because we don't know, but it is about 9,000 pounds. Mm-hmm. The granite here weighs about 163 pounds per cubic foot, so you can do the dimensions and figure out the weight. It does sit up on four legs, and when Mr. Goodwin photographed it, it was buried just to the bottom of the stone. It looked like it was sitting on the ground. The four legs were not visible, and as his workers actually excavated around the table, as they went down, they found it was actually sitting on four legs, much to their surprise. And the earliest photograph we have of that is 1920, and it's right against that same wall. It's been speculation that the table is a limestone for making soap, maybe by the Patty family in the 1800s, or maybe a cider press. There's no archaeological, historical evidence supporting that theory. It's more of an opinion. And if you Google cider presses and if you Google limestones are usually 36, 40 inches across, maybe an inch and a half thick, and they can have some exceptions. And they have a very shallow round groove that a barrel would sit on with ashes, and then you put water in it leaches through, then you mix that with animal fat and make your soap. The site seems so ceremonial, with the oracle chambers behind it. The biggest chamber still on the site is right to the left of that stone. It's actually sitting against the wall, and it's over 30 feet long. It has a east-west avenue also, and when you look at that picture, you can't see the oracle chamber. And by the way, that roof right there is where we got one of the cores. We thought that the soil was only a few inches thick. And before they came up to do the OSL project, I went out with a T-rod and I measured it, and it varied from 17 inches of soil on top of the roof up to 24. And they said that would be an ideal candidate to get a nice core, because if the soil had to come after the building of the structure, obviously. You don't build a structure under the soil. The walls are built. They might have put cribbing in there, then they slid the roof slabs on top. And at some point, the dirt accumulates on top of the structure, even if they shoveled some of it up there in ancient So the dirt that they got would be near the, was down about 24 inches almost, just on top of the roof slab, and that would be the oldest soil. And that's one of the cores we're waiting for right now.
Well, and on
but the table is kind of a bell shape. You can see the groove in the runnel that runs off the table there.
Well, what I wanted to ask you too is that theory that it could be a colonial person's press, right, of some sort.
A cider press or
cider. Yeah. Now, if that's the case, wouldn't it have been in a enclosed a building, right? It would have been covered.
You're right. Yeah, it would have had something.
So
that's correct.
What about the erosion on the rock? Because you can clearly see erosion, right?
Yeah, I mean, geologists have looked at that, including Scott Walters, and it has been exposed to the elements for a very, very long time. The groove is man-made, of course, and the groove looks rectangular. 4 years ago, before Dr. David Smith, the guy that had been with us for 40 years, he had a doctorate in theology, a doctorate in historical anthropology, and he was a trained archaeologist. He said basically he thought that maybe the groove could have been a later addition, and it looked like it was rectangular, about 4 feet by 6. And I went up the next morning after we were talking, and I measured it, and it had really not been done before as far as the groove. And I found out that it's not really 4 by 6, and it comes out to some odd number of inches, on all the measurements. But I did find out it's trapezoid in shape. It's about 9 inches roughly narrower at the top on the left side of the picture than it is at the bottom. I always thought it was a rectangle. Now, the measurements of the groove do not conform to, inches, feet, or yards. But when I took my phone and used a calculator on it with the inches, it comes out nicely to 1.5 megalithic yards at the bottom, to the center of the groove. The top is 1.25. The length is 2 megalithic yards of the groove. And the table, the width of it's kind of hard because it's bell-shaped, but I did the maximum width of it was 2.5 megalithic yards. And near the top of the bell where it curves in, it was 2. And the corner on the left side, as you look at it, to the bedrock, to the top of the rock, was 32 and a half inches, which is just about a megalithic yard. And we started measuring some of the big slabs there, like the one you can see behind it that's standing, and there's another one to the left you can't see. Then we got into the chambers and started measuring that. And my son's an engineer, too. He's a mechanical engineer. He does electrical engineering, too. And we went in there and measured that very carefully. That's the oracle chamber. That's looking true north-south direction.
Well, tell us about the oracle chamber, because that's really interesting. How apparently you could hear someone speaking from the oracle chamber to the stone slab we were just looking at, the table.
It's an amazing chamber. It has so many features, including what we call the speaking tube, which is not really in the frame there. It is, but you can't really see it. It's on the top left, and it goes to the left. It's about a 1 foot by several inch square rectangular tube, I guess, and it goes 6 feet through. It comes out underneath the sacrificial table. And there's a step of bedrock. You can see some wooden steps there, walkway. On the left side of that walkway, you can see a piece of the bedrock still. And if you stand on that bedrock, it's like a slab or a step that they kept there. So somebody got in there and they quarried away some of the stone and they left that step there. Somebody about 5.5 feet tall, I'm like almost 5'8", standing there, your face is the proper level in that tube, and you yell, and the voice comes out underneath the sacrificial table. And on that side, the speaking tube actually fans out. It's just below the table in that picture on the left side. You can see a little shadow. That's where the speaking tube comes out. And it's actually trumpet-shaped, although it's like a rectangular trumpet shape. It flares out. So it's kind of acoustical, and the voice will come out, and it sounds like somebody's, like the Wizard of Oz kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, how would that function if that was a cider press or a lye stone? By the way, there's no way to get a horse in there with a wagon full of apples or to take away the products or any of the pulp they squeeze. I have 3 ATVs. I have a small one from 1984, a big red they call it. It's a small one. I can't get that in there to get the leaves out each fall. I have to carry the leaves out by hand. My point is you can't get in there with a horse and a wagon to bring your produce in there, whatever you're squeezing, and you wouldn't be able to get the product out of there. There's just no way. It's too tight, Yeah,
I have a question from Bill Skywatcher, our producer,
sure.
And that's, has there been any underground survey of the area for hidden chambers?
We have used a ground penetration radar more recently, as I mentioned. She actually did the oracle chamber. And then we did a couple areas to the west outside the main site. And there's one area out there that in 1995 or 94, we also using ground penetration radar. It was much older generation, and they were making it right down the street from us. Their sister company was Klein, and Klein made the side-scan sonar that found the Titanic and the Space Shuttle Challenger. Mm-hmm. My dad knew Marty Klein. Their sister company, they got together years later, and that was Geophysical Survey Systems. And this in the 90s, they used to bring their equipment up and use the radar on our place to demonstrate it to people from around the world. And we were so fortunate. And there was one area that they said, you have a cavity out here. And we thought it was just flat bedrock with a very thin soil covering. I said, well, I think it's solid bedrock, and it goes down for miles. Well, we just ran the more up-to-date radar on it last year. Doria did. And she said, yeah, there is something down here. So you should do an excavation down here. So she described what it was. We have all the printouts now. It's the new software and the new hardware is better than it was in 1995. And so that's an area we're going to do another shovel test pit and see what we have there. She came up with a couple of ideas, what it could be, and they were kind of intriguing. And it would be something to do with humans, and I don't want to really get into it, but, because there's going to be some sensitive stuff going on there. But she said, you should look at this. And she's a geophysicist, and she's worked with archaeologists, and she was pretty adamant in what she said, but she says, you won't know till you dig. So that was outside. That was about 200 feet from the main site.
Wait, you can't go into it because it's personal, or?
Not personal, but archaeologically it can be sensitive. We don't want anybody messing around with it, too.
I see.
Because you know how people, they'll get inquisitive, and next thing you know, I had a group of people show up one day with a bunch of metal locators. I have my own metal locators. My dad, my uncles actually built them, and we had a lot of fun with metal locators. But I think they were coming up to do a dig, just the clear blue sky. I saw them walking up to our visitor center. I'm like, we don't let people metal locate because the next thing to do is digging. We don't allow digging. Yeah. Our archaeologist does that. You could work and help them, but you're not going to go up and dig.
Yeah, people can go and visit. Just a reminder to everybody listening. This is, it's what is it? It's like $12 a ticket to go.
It's like $14 for adults, and then we have discounts for groups and kids and senior citizens, military, that kind of. And if they buy online, they can get it. They can get a discount too.
And also, you have alpacas.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. That is so cool. So why do you have alpacas on this land?
Well, that one there, I think, is Cindy Lulu. We got her 2 years ago, and we got a couple pregnant ones. Well, my son got interested in it back in 2002. He was, I think, about 12 years old, going on 13. Mm-hmm. And he got into to breed them, to enjoy them, and maybe sell some of the babies in the fiber. But we've never sold any of the babies. But they're actually part of the North American camel. Now, people don't know that all the camels in the world came from North America. They're here going back to about 45 million years. That's the earliest, record that we have of them. They were about the size of a bunny rabbit back then. And the last ones, they believe, died out something around 8,000 years ago. And about 10 years ago in Mesa, Arizona, at a Walmart parking lot, they were putting some trees into shade. And this couple babies, they call them crias, in 2006. That one there was... which one was that one there? That was one of the females. The mom on the right is still around. She's almost 20 years old. Her name is Ashley. And there's Barney right there. He was born in 2007, and he's one of our biggest alpacas. He's a great guy.
Really are unique creatures, aren't they?
But their ancestral home is North America, and they migrated into South America, and they became the vacuna, the llama alpaca, two types of alpacas, and so these animals, and then they went overseas into Asia, through Alaska. So these animals are actually indigenous to North America. Their ancestors were. They're all part of. We have pyramids here. We had alpacas. Their ancestors here.
Dennis, I found some of these images on your Facebook account, and I'm wondering what are when people are coming to America's Stonehenge. What are these ceremonies that I see?
That would be, I think, a summer solstice celebration. That was a clay goddess built a number of years ago near the summer solstice. So that can be removed. It didn't impact it was not intrusive to the site. It's just sitting on top of the surface. It's made out of clay. And there it is in a different year. And they do that every summer solstice. Sometimes they'll come in the spring and fall. And the lady that does that, she's from Holland originally, and she does kind of a Native American, African, and kind of a New Age kind of a ritual, and she'll have people there dancing. And there she is right there. Her name is Katja. Mm-hmm. And she hasn't been up for about a year and a half because of COVID-19. So, but she came for about 25 years. She might come back again, once everything settles down again. And you can see the group of people. They do that at Stonehenge. They do that at a lot of these different sites, ancient sites around the world.
And why do you think we're drawn to these ancient sites? I mean, there's so much that we don't know. So why would we be even attracted to celebrate around it in the first place?
Yeah, the celebrations of the changing of the seasons for one thing, that's kind of universal. Longest day of the year, the shortest day of the year, and then the mid year, the equinox too. And the site has probably a layering of cultures, maybe going back thousands of years. And because where she's from in Holland, I mentioned one of the East-West Chamber, they call them the Giants, but she's very familiar with some of the megalithic sites over in Holland. So this might have brought back a little bit of that for her. She grew up over there and she knew all about these megalithic sites there. But I think it's because it's a spiritual place. It's on a hill, and it's probably not a living place. The people probably lived in hide, wood, or box, something perishable. And that's a problem with megalithic sites in Western Europe and probably other places in the world. They're pretty clean archaeologically, like a churches. They respected these places. They didn't leave their trash there. You will find we have found hammer stones, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, stone picks. We have found Stone Age tools. And the way the stones are shaped up there, and I think one of your questions was, were these stones from the hilltop? The glacial stones, the field stones were brought in by the glaciers from elsewhere, probably northwest of here. But the big flat stones were quarried off the bedrock. And we have 34 of them right now. We've just been finding them since 1982. And recently, since 2016, I probably found 15 more. These are bedrock that's been lifted off the bedrock. It's been split from the bedrock and then propped up with like a field stone, a rounded rock, generally, sometimes, squarish rock.
Okay.
But the point is they separated it from the bedrock. They raised it up. And then if you look at the edge of these stones, there's a serration. In fact, that stone in front of you can see one of the little notches there that somebody knocked off. And what Dr. David Stewart Smith found working with our site for 40 years is that they used a technology called percussion flaking. And this is how they shaped or dressed a stone. And a state archaeologist, his name was Dr. Gary Hume. He's still around, but he's retired. And he had the same last name as our archaeologist, and they're friends, and they live near each other, but they're not married, as everybody thinks. She was married to a geologist, not an archaeologist. He was there in 1983 observing the excavation in front of one of these propped up stones. And on the bedrock, several inches of soil had accumulated. And underneath that dirt, right on the bedrock, they found all the little flakes of stone that had been hammered off. And that supported the fact that these stones are being shaped much like knapping an arrowhead, a spear point, or a stone axe, or a stone knife. It is a Stone Age technology. And he said it's unmistakable. These big slabs are shaped as if they're multi-ton arrowheads. And that's not Metal Age, that's Stone Age.
It almost seems like, well, we know how to do this on a small scale. We're going to build this big thing. You're just upscaling the current technology that you have. Right. What are these markings here in this image? It looks like a chamber entrance.
That's in the oracle chamber near what we call the exit today, which is actually a small window. Mm-hmm. And they used to call it the running gear carving, the running gear. But if you look at it, the antler is incorrect. The antlers, the head's on the left, the antler's above it. It looks more like, there you go, perfect. What it looks like, even in the 1960s, they thought it looked like an ibex, which is, I believe, part of the goat family, and it's found in Western Europe. And if you Google ibex, you'll find there's various types of ibex, including some that are extinct. But the Spanish ibex or the Iberian ibex looks so much like that. And the inscriptions that we have found on our site, starting in this was found in 1937 by Mr. Goodwin, but some of the inscriptions that were found looked at by Dr. Barry Fell in 1975. He was an invertebrate marine zoologist from Harvard University. He was born in New Zealand, went to school in Edinburgh, came to the United States, taught at Harvard. But his pastime was becoming a kind of a linguist. He would study ancient scripts. He could read about 15 ancient, inscriptions like Phoenician, Celtic, Libyan, Minoan, Linear A, B, Egyptian, all sorts of ancient script, but he could speak 7 modern languages too. So he wrote books like America BC in 1976, Bronze Age America, Saga America. And he raised a lot of eyebrows, a lot of anger, and people, just really trashed him basically from the academic field, saying nobody came across the oceans and left these stones. These stones are found from Maine all the way down to Brazil. And some of these stones are found, like the one in Brazil was found in 1872 by some slaves that were doing some work, and they overturned or whatever, and they brought it to the attention of authorities. And nobody really did much with it until a little bit later, and they looked at it. Apparently were Phoenician writings. So these slaves had really keen eyes. They were really great to bring it but the mainstream, again, didn't really want to look at them. It was like, no, they shouldn't be there. But from the East Coast of the United States and Canada all the way out to the West Coast, Phoenician, Libyan, and Celtic type writings have been found. Now, they were either misinterpretations or a lot of hoaxes, fakes, frauds, or whatever. But there are just thousands of them across the United States. In our site, we have Libyan, Phoenician, and Celtic. And what Barry Fell says is these inscriptions were from Iberia, Spain and Portugal, and that was a jumping off spot. The Phoenicians came out of the Middle East, and the Celts came out of, I believe, the Ural Mountains in Russia, and they moved right across past Greece, right across Europe, right into Ireland. Eventually, the Celts did, and they actually were in Spain too. And the Libyans from northern Africa actually were in Spain, and this is not like controversial. They were there. It's all there. Mm-hmm. So basically, he felt that was a stepping off spot, just like for Columbus coming into the New World, and so.
Okay, we're gonna open up the phone lines to everybody. So if you want to call in and ask Dennis your question, that's 1-855-472-5483 for the Paranormal Radio App phone lines. That's 1-85-KGRA live. So call in, ask Dennis your question, and or propose your own theory as to what you think this site is. Dennis, I have a question from Master Player 30. Can we pet the alpacas?
If they come up to you, you can, and if they're in a good mood. Otherwise, they might spit at you. They're just like a camel. They do like to spit. Yep. And but yeah, if they come up to you, they like their necks. Don't do their head, or you will get spit on. And so they all have personalities too. They can be in a good mood or bad mood or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few videos of alpaca spitting on YouTube. Steve Humphrey has a question. Does anyone know if the structures are aligned with summer or winter solstice? Yes, that's true. We've talked about that, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And I have another question.
Good question. Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Magnus, I heard that Phoenician writing was found at the site. Any truth to that? And so, do you believe that there's any Phoenician writing on your site?
Well, that's what Barry Fell identified: Iberian Punic, or Phoenician from Spain and Portugal.
But
the Phoenicians were in Spain.
Not symbols, but writing.
Yeah, actual writing. And one of them is found in the chamber, what we call a chamber in ruins. It has about a 7,000 pound roof slab that's fallen into the chamber, and a lintel stone that was over the doorway that fell in first. The roof came down on top of that. And that chamber has never been excavated because the stones are in the way. But in the 1960s, they were trying to maybe get the stone roof out of there and the lintel. So they were kind of working around the chamber, and they found the Iberian Punic, what Barry Fels was Iberian Punic. They found that stone. It was on display for about 9 years in our visitor center as unknown. And then they found another one in 1967, and they found a third one. And Barry Fell in 1975 first visited the site, and then he took some of these stones back. You can actually pick up some of them. They're actually portable. Mm-hmm. And he brought them back to Islington, Massachusetts, where he lived, and he studied them, and that's his interpretation that this Phoenician, Libyan, and Celtic found at our site. Across the Americas, these stones are inscribed too.
It's just difficult for me to believe that if an expert says that there's Phoenician writing found on your property, that would not be of keen interest to archaeologists.
It raised a lot of anger, I can tell you that, and a lot of controversy. David H. Kelly, he's a famous linguist. I think he went to Harvard, and he ended up in Alberta, Canada, but he criticized Fell, but he also gave Fell a lot of credit for what he was doing. He says Fell sometimes rushes to judgment. He sometimes misses a line on an inscription. Sometimes he inserts what looks like a very faint line that may not be there, but he says essentially he's correct, And he's one of the guys that he just passed away a few years ago, but, he's one of the people that the mainstream would look at and, respect his word. Mm-hmm. I was on a radio show out of Long Island, though, and I started saying, well, Barry Fell was both criticized and he was also given some credit. As soon as he said the credit, I don't think the host liked that too much. And I actually have the written documents with David Kelly say, I had the paragraphs quoted exactly what he said, in many different papers. He both criticized Fell, and he also gave him credit for saying, hey, it looks like there was somebody coming in from the old world, So Fell deserves his criticism too, for sure,
Yeah, absolutely.
My dad used to have arguments with him at night over some of the stuff, and it got heated to where they wouldn't even talk for a few weeks, So my dad wasn't in total agreement. And my dad was a linguist, but he said, Barry, don't you think you're jumping to conclusions and, maybe step back or whatever, And so that kind of thing goes on, But I think effectively, and basically, Fell might be on the right track.
Is there a future for a documentary series like Curse of Oak Island, but for Stonehenge? I mean, can you do some digging, and what are your plans as far as?
Well, the OSL dating, when we get those, we'll have 3 more cores, and that may trigger that we need more cores to support that, to double check. But that might trigger more people that are fence sitters, mainstream and others, saying, hey, I can now, that's scientific. I can go along with that. That's what I needed to go get on board with this whole thing. And those other New England sites and New York site, when that results come out too, I think that should be very, very interesting. There is a structure in Upton, Massachusetts, that Malcolm Pearson, that gentleman I mentioned, my dad got the site from. When he was 16, about 100 years ago, they bought the property, and the gentleman said something about a foundation out back. So got the kid's interest. He went out there, and it's this beautiful structure. It looks like an igloo underground, or what they would call I think they call it not a brown burrow, but a passage grave in Europe. Kind of like the inside of Newgrange, but a little bit smaller, quite a bit smaller. But the same kind of like igloo shape, the core building and everything. And they did, David Stewart Smith was there. He passed away in 2016. They took cores 2011. Took 5 years to get the results. And the medium date came back on that near the entrance of 1488 AD. They want to go back and take some more tests because that's a minimum date, but it puts it before, not only before the colonial period that some farmer could have built it 200 or 300 years ago, which is what the naysayers said. It's only 200 or 300 years old. It's going back over 600 years. So who the heck was there 600 years ago if it wasn't colonial farmers or post-colonial? But it's before the time of Columbus too. So it's like, it's not colonial. That's the answer by name.
It seems no matter which route of investigation you go down, it does seem to be pre-colonial, whether it's by 600 years or thousands of years.
Yeah.
So that seems like it's pretty solid evidence. I wish there was an archaeologist that would write a paper on this and submit it. I have a question from Susan. What is Dennis's opinion concerning L.A. Marzulli's theory on American Stonehenge? Are you familiar with L.A.'s theory? Yes,
we are. L.A. thinks the site's old, number one, but he's into the Nephilim, the giants. And there have been some reports of some giants in New England, like up in Tufton Borough, New Hampshire, on Lake Winnipesaukee, some historical papers and stuff like that. At our site, the chambers, the tallest one is about 6'5". So if it was built for giants, it's not that big. But LA does think that he was really into the astronomical alignments and how they go out to other sites. And we agree with that because if you Google Earth, our summer solstice sunrise, which my son did in 2012 while he was in college, that became part of the show with Scott Walters, America on Earth. That line goes right through the center of Stonehenge, through one of the triathlons. And LA was all over that too. But the south alignment goes by Machu Picchu, and you have to use Google Earth, and you have to be very careful with it because if you have the angle off a little bit, it can miss a structure by, 3,000 miles is going to miss it by quite a few miles. But we did it over and over again. And the equinox sunset goes through Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon. The winter solstice sunset goes through the moon pyramid at Teotihuacan in Mexico, which I've been to with my dad. And LA wants to take me to the Canary Islands because our equinox sunrise goes right through the truncated pyramids in the Canary Islands that most people don't know even exist. So we're going to try to do that this year, but I think C19 might put that up. He's a wonderful guy. He has some great theories. The sacrificial table is bell-shaped. The New England Antiquities Research Association's logo is actually from a carving or a raised carving called an anaglyph from Mount Mineral in Shutesbury, Massachusetts. And in 1964, when the group was formed, they had to look for a logo like everybody does with a group or whatever. And they chose this stone that was overturned by a farmer. It's next to some stone chambers, too. And the stone was a carving, and it looks like the shape of our table with a person stretched out. And the table's 9 feet, and this person is as big as the table. And when I showed that to L.A., he almost jumped, 20 feet in the air. He was like, oh, my God. But we don't know. It's really interesting looks like a person lying on the table with something across their neck. Mm-hmm. And by their front left leg, and their legs are spread out. So some people suggest it's a birthing table, but it was a big, big woman or person. But by the front left foot, I should say, that's where the runnel is on our table, that little runoff. And they have a circle, like it's a lip of a vase. Like that might be where they collected the fluid. So there's a lot of interesting things about that carving, and that's about 75 miles from our site, southwest of us in Massachusetts. Yeah, and that is
that seems to make more sense. A birthing table would seem odd because it's actually biologically it doesn't make sense for a woman to lay flat on her back, right? So that doesn't hold water. But we have our first call from Ron from Minnesota. You're on Paranormal Now with Dennis Stone.
Hey, Alan. Hey, Dennis. How you doing?
Hey, Ron. Welcome.
Hey, Ron. How's it going?
Good to hear you again. Good to see you again also.
Oh, I know who you are. Thank you for calling. Nice to hear from you.
I had a question about the you mentioned it a little bit about how they shape the stones. How would they get something that big to break the stones? I mean, those stones are massive. Like when they go to cut the stones, I see where you're going with that. How else are they going to do it? But then the other thing is, how are they going to move them? Or did they dig into the ground or break away with rocks? Or, you know what I'm saying? To make those shapes.
He's making a good point, too. If I sent two of you out to go find me a stone of a certain size and you walked around the property, the 110 acres, let's say, today it's covered with forest and earth and, the bedrock's covered except for some areas that are exposed. 4,000 years ago, you two would have walked around and the bedrock would have been more exposed. And you could say, hey, look at that rock right there. I think we can separate that. What David Stewart Smith said is he would work a fissure or crack in the bedrock and somehow get wedges in there to separate it. And even when he died after 40 years of working on this, he says, I'm still not sure how these people were able to separate the bedrock. But it is foliated. It's kind of like an onion. You can get it separated. But to get the actual size of the stone you want and the shape of it, the shaping would be done with hammer stones. But when you're prying a stone up and you want it a certain size, how do you do that without breaking it incorrectly or doing it correctly, And we have 34 of those stones still lying all over the hill. Some of these are multi-ton, up to 1,000 feet from the main site. And it dawned on us most recently that the site may have never been complete. It was like we used to think the site was complete, and then it fell to ruin. And then in the 1800s, the Patty family built a house up there. And, and then some of the stones were taken away by quarrymen in the 1850s. So Patties were building it. Why were they having people tearing it down at the same time? And you showed some drill marks. Those are 1800s. That type of technology started around 1800, actually drilling into the stones, putting a plug and feather, and then you just like perforating a stone, and then you hit the wedges with a maul and you split it. And that's modern technology with metal tools. And we actually have one of the toolkits that was left behind by the quarrymen when the Patty family was there. So how did the ancient people do that? That still mystified David Stewart Smith after 40 years of research, but he said they did it. And we saw how many of these big slabs are still all over the hilltop. It dawned on us that these guys had a bigger plan for this site. They may have wanted to drag these stones up and build more chambers on the hilltop. And then the question is, why did they stop? What was the problem? Was it something to do with climate, maybe warfare, maybe disease, maybe something else? There's been a suggestion that when the Bronze Age ended, copper and tin were used to make bronze. And these people may have been coming to the New World to obtain these products going back to the Old World. When the Iron Age started, you can get iron everywhere, out of bogs. It's cheap, and all you need is the temperature to actually make the tools to heat it and smelt it hot enough. But so if the Bronze Age ended, it might have been economic. They no longer needed to come over here again. That was another thought. It's not proven. It's just one of those theories that's out there. So why did they abandon our site and maybe some of the other 800 sites in the Northeast? That's a great question. We just don't have any data to make, even come up with a real good, theory on that yet, I don't think,
Thanks, Ron. Do you have another question?
Good question, Ron. Thank you.
Oh, Ellen, and thank you, Dennis. All right.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So are these living quarters at all? Is there any way that they can be perceived as a temporary shelter for emergency situations, or are these livable in any way?
Unless somebody, maybe somebody could have used it for that purpose, not the original builders, we don't think. There is a bed. This bed is in the oracle chamber. The oracle chamber has so many features. It has 5 stone closets or niches. It has 2 underground drains, 2 of the 12, and these are storm drains. And some of these drains run up to 75 feet. They're actually parallel walls with capstones, and they were used to keep the place dry. Because if you don't have as much soil thousands of years ago on the hilltop and around the site, when it rains or the snow melts, then the water just puddles up on the bedrock. It has nowhere to go. So they actually cut channels in the bedrock, and those channels are maybe an inch deep, maybe an inch and a half by maybe 4 inches wide, roughly. And they'll run into an underground drain, and then the water disappears. And it goes sometimes up to 75 feet. And one of the drains actually has a sump pit. A sump pit's almost like a leach field. It's all these rocks, like a collection of rocks that the water goes into. I don't believe it's a sewer, but I think it's just for rainwater and snow melt. And they kept the the site dry. They engineered all the drains and all the carvings in the bedrock before they built the chambers above. So they actually planned it out, I think. And but the oracle chamber has a bed, and it's about 8 feet long. And if you come up and visit, and you got to come up with Bill, when you walk into the oracle chamber, you'll never know it's there. It's actually hidden on your left side, and it's actually a stone window that if you laid in there with your head near the entrance, you could actually look out the window and see if anybody entered it. The oracle chamber, Oracle 2, was actually blocked by 2 stone plugs when Mr. Goodwin first came there, and his workers started cleaning. And one of them rattled one of the stones, and it came loose. He pulled it out. It's probably a foot by 1.5 feet wide, maybe a foot deep. They didn't save these 2 stone plugs. I wish they had. But when they pulled it out, they found the shaft going through 6 feet. And they went to inside the oracle chamber because that was under the table. And they found another stone plug. And then some of the drains, which are on the bedrock down by your feet, they had stone plugs in them too. Like they actually winterized the place, and it looks like they might have closed it up, winterized it or whatever. And they actually took care to kind of shut it down.
So when
we have these big slabs all over the hilltop, like they're going to continue building. And that never happened. In Europe, some of the stones that we used to build Stonehenge came from Wales. And I saw a TV show with Megan Fox, and they call some of the stones lazy stones because they never made it from the quarry site. They were actually taken out of the quarry. They started preparing it, shaping it, dressing it, and they never moved it to where its destination was. Mm-hmm. We have about 34 of those. And the distance wasn't 150 miles like Stonehenge. This is only like up to 1,000 feet here. But they're just sitting there, and they're being slowly covered with earth and trees and everything. And when you see them, like, oh, my God, there's another one, just peeking through the soil. Some of these are several feet across.
Dennis, when you say winterized, does that mean that there's a change in temperature as well? Because normally when you see a structure like this, you might think in terms of a basement or a cellar. It's cooler usually. It's good for storing foods. But if it's winterized, then I assume that would be a counter effect to a cooling.
It's more of a metaphor, I think. Like, when we had a camp up at Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire, we just sold, but we had to winterize it. Otherwise, all the pipes froze and everything. Yeah. I think it's almost like these people shut the place down. Maybe it was seasonal, and they blocked up some of the things like the oracle tube. You wouldn't want somebody sneaking in there and seeing this tube because it was like the Wizard of Oz. If a priest or shaman was in the oracle tube giving commands through that tube, all it looked like was a wall there. But when the plugs are gone, you could actually see, oh, this is a big fake, Somebody's yelling through this hole in the wall,
So then
I went to Malta back in 97, and they had the same kind of thing in Malta, except there are holes. I said to the guide in Malta, there are 4 islands. We went to 2 of them, Gozo and the mainland. But I said, what are those? What is that there? I think it was Gigantia, one of the big sites. And he goes, that's an oracle tube. That's where a priest or somebody would talk, and the voice would go through to people listening, That's what we got at our place.
Well, it sounds to me like it is something more sacred, right? Because if it was just a practical building, they wouldn't have done that. Because you wouldn't waste space like that, I wouldn't think.
I think when you look at the site, you'll see that there's so much detail, there's so much work that went into it, and the chambers have so much stonework, tons of stones, and they're put together so nicely, but they yield so little space. If you want to have something efficient, you made it out of wood, like you make a shed or a barn or a carriage house or whatever. It does not look like a farm. I lived on the farm for the first 3 years of my airline career up in Rutland, Vermont, and North Clarendon. I lived on a farm, and there are farms all around us. And as I ride my 10-speed bike for exercise, or when I was actually flying around, I look down and say, this does not look like our site. There are chambers in Vermont, too, that are probably related to the same culture, Woodstock, Royalton, Putney, Vermont. Mm-hmm. And Vermont has the most inscriptions, by the way. We're talking about inscriptions. Vermont has the most inscriptions of anywhere in the Northeast. But our site doesn't look like a cider mill. It doesn't look like the ivory soap, for making soap with a limestone. And the Patty family were 5 generations of shoemakers. They were cordwainers. It doesn't really look like a shoe shop or a factory either, And that's what it's been called, The Patties built it for that. So I think it's very ceremonial.
Have any bones or burials been found nearby?
Yeah, actually back in 1937, Goodwin found a couple of bones. They were in our museum eventually, 20 years later, in 1958 on display. Mm-hmm. 1968, a woman, and I forget her name offhand, she came from Plaskow, New Hampshire. She was one of the researchers. She was a school teacher, too. She actually brought the stones to the Smithsonian. And there was a woman, Dr. Lucy Huygen, I think her name was. We have all the files. She looked at these bones, 3 bones, and she also had some of her consultants look at them. And she said, there's markings on these bones. The marks that are scars on these bones where the person was alive, number one. And number two, they appear to be human. Now, this is 1968, and they had been out of the ground for over 30 years. When you do radiocarbon date anything organic, you have to put it in aluminum and protect it immediately, or you contaminate it. They sat in our museum, so you can't do carbon-14. But I've been talking to L.A. Mazzulli about this because he's done some of the Paracas skulls in South America, these big lawn skulls, with DNA. And so there's a company up in Canada, in Ontario, that he has been working with, and we're thinking of possibly finding out whether these could be looked at for DNA analysis.
What kind of DNA?
To see if they're human, number one. And that was, he said...
mitochondrial, or can you do the full spectrum?
Maybe the full thing, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure whether they can be. And I think I'd like to see everything done to them, you know. And I'm no expert in that area, but I think DNA may be a thing we want to do with these bones. We still have them on display in our museum. If you come up, you can look at them, you know. Okay, yeah. And I'd love to. One other thing they said about the bones, they seem to be of a denser bone material than would be expected, whatever expected is. I'm not, I don't know all of that science, but they said, but my personal opinion, these are human bones. Okay. Now, bones in New England.
We only have a few minutes left, Dennis. So okay. I have to ask you before we go.
Sure.
Ancient aliens, yay or nay?
Ancient aliens. Well, we used to talk about that in the 70s. So if they had all that high tech, these stones are cut crudely using percussion flaking, not with lasers. However, I mean, I do think the universe is full of life, and maybe some of it's visited us. But our site looks like it's a Stone Age kind of site because of tools, the way the stones are shaped. However, these people were very bright too. They aligned with 57 alignments. They even have the mid-year alignment. And people aren't from, the equinox. If you count from the equinox to the summer solstice, the winter solstice, because the Earth goes around the sun, not in a circle, but an ellipse, you have to, if you want to set up a mid-year divider, you have to put it 1 degree north of your equinox for the sunrise, 2 days difference, and you count from that, and it's 91 days. They had both of these things at our site. Talk about sophistication. Why would a farmer do that?
Yeah.
Or a shoemaker.
Last question of the evening, because you are on Paranormal Now, and we're speaking about L.A. Marzulli as well. I mean, could the giants be a Sasquatch type creature? Well, I'm friends with Ronnie LeBlanc, and I should ask him that. And he's on the Bigfoot expedition, and he's been to our site and gave me the T-shirt. We're kind of friends, and I talk to him every now and then. And he's on Travel Channel, so that'd be a great question to ask Ronnie. I know in Derry, New Hampshire, there was reports of a giant, some sort of scat, whatever it was. It's in the Nutfield, the history of Nutfield. It's actually in that book by I think Richard Holmes, I think, is the author. So, all right, if you want to find out more about Dennis Stone and America's Stonehenge, go to StonehengeUSA.com. Dennis, I think that you're just begging for a reality TV show, like honest to goodness. But if the opportunity comes your way, I hope it's a good one.
You're hired. You'd be my producer.
Okay.
I would love to share, what we know about the site. That would be fantastic. I mean, what we know about it. I'd love to talk to people about this. So.
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating, and you're full of knowledge, which I think is really quite impressive. Because you're not just micro focused on your specific site. You have a wider range of knowledge, which I think helps, because if someone is coming to this as a skeptic, the more associated knowledge and related facts and evidence that you can connect to it, then you're helping your case here. And I think that's really, really interesting. I mean, who in America wouldn't want our own Stonehenge or multiple Stonehenge? There's so many mysteries, and I don't know if we'll ever know who those people are. But maybe we will someday. Maybe it was the Phoenicians. Maybe it was Native Americans. Maybe it was both. I mean, maybe the Vikings came over here and they worked together on a temporary settlement for whatever reason. So I guess you don't really have one theory that you're stuck on, right?
We're just looking for the truth, wherever the evidence leads us, and we have different theories, but, we may be wrong, it may be something completely different, but, I don't think it's what the skeptics think it is, though. And I think the evidence and the OSL may really push it forward. And that could happen. We may be getting the results any day now. So that they may support the carbon datings and the astronomical data and all the Stone Age technology used to dress the stones. It may all support that,
All right, Dennis, thank you so much for coming on.
So thank you so much, Alan. And you and Bill have to come up and pay a visit anytime you want.
Sounds
Thank you.
perfect. We're moving into the springtime, summer. Hopefully, we'll be in a much better place, post pandemic. So that would be fantastic. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And yeah, I'm always plugging UFO Monument Park in Sheffield, Massachusetts. This is just one more site to see up here in the Northeast. So come up this summer. Check out these really fascinating sites. There's so much to offer on these topics of paranormal, alternate realities, and hidden histories in our little neck of the woods. Thank you once again for listening to KGRA Radio on KGRADB.com, your official contact for the best in alternative talk radio. To find out more, you can go to KGRradio.com/paranormalnow or follow me on Twitter at paranormal_now. Special thank you to Eric Brager, our head of operations, and our producer, Bill Skywatcher. Until next time, everyone, live in the mystery.